Hello, my most saintly of followers, and welcome back to the Celestial Perch. Today I have a new Civic Deep Dive, and per the poll, we will be looking into the Pleasure Seeker's Civic. This one is quite interesting. I've wanted to look at it as it has had some changes recently to the actual living standard that it gives you, and we'll be looking into all the benefits, how they play out, and just my overall opinion and rating of it. But we can go ahead and get started, and we will be looking at each one, and this one will have a little bit more of a testing actually put into it, as the Decadent lifestyle living standard requires a bit more testing for me to actually have a viable opinion. So, looking at Pleasure Seekers overall, you can see we have three main benefits. The first one being the Decadent lifestyle living standard, 1% pop growth speed from entertainers, 5 amenities from our servants, and we have 3 requirements to meet, being that we cannot have slaver guilds, warrior culture, or shared burdens. A quick little aside before we continue, the astute might have noticed that corporate hedonism is the exact same thing as pleasure seekers. The only difference is that you have to be a megacorp to take corporate hedonism. Now, I will of course keep that in mind when we do the reviews, as there are differences in playstyles that would warrant a different opinion or review depending on which Civic you take. Now, we're going to start with the smaller bonuses first, being the pop growth speed from entertainers and the 5 amenities from servants, as the living standard will require the most kind of discussion as well as testing, so I'll leave that for last. But we can start first with the 1% pop growth speed from entertainers. Putting the entertainer's job up here on the screen, this is a relatively minor benefit, as most of the time you're going to want to reduce the amount of entertainers you have on your planet, and you really only want to maybe build one holo theater or entertainer building on each planet, and building one should be well and away enough amenities to get the double amenities or close to the 20% happiness bonus that you can have from having double the amenities that a pop needs. As there kind of is some diminishing returns in having too many amenities, and it eventually just doesn't really do anything. The unity generation here on entertainers also isn't enough, and comparing it to just other jobs that can do a roughly similar thing, or just other jobs in general, you're never really going to want to build entertainers to take advantage of this bonus. And 1% pop growth speed just isn't really cutting it. So this doesn't really add too much to the Civic, and I would say is more so here just for flavor. And moving on to the other relatively minor benefit here, we get plus 5 amenities to our servant jobs. Now shown on the screen here, servants will produce us plus 4 amenities, and will have minus 0.5 pop housing usage if biological. We can use this either with servitude AI policy or domestic servitude slavery. There are 2 major things that come to mind, and after a little bit of research, they do have some potential here, as the first one is that in the late game, if you just have a ton of pops and you've recently taken someone over, you can, for the time being, put them in domestic servitude, and they will provide amenities for your worlds, being servants rather than just being unemployed, unhappy slaves. The other benefit is that if you are using the Thrall World designation, where you will get a lot of pop growth speed, the downside here is that you normally cannot build holotheaters or entertainer jobs. So you would have to work the relatively terrible toiler job as shown here. It's just a plus 2 amenities. But if you have the domestic servitude slavery type and all of your unemployed pops on the Thrall Worlds become servants, and now you'll actually be able to support relatively large Thrall Worlds in the mid-game, where it might normally be a little bit too difficult, as it could be hard to keep the amenities high there, and you might run into some issues with your slaves. But overall, these are both relatively minor. There could be some other potential with necrophages, but at least from what I've seen from other players, there don't really seem to be too many issues with the servant job there. And just having the servants is kind of a stepping stone, and not something that you would use long term, though it doesn't really necessarily need to be any better than it already is. But those are the 2 minor benefits that we get from pleasure seekers and corporate hedonism. But going over that, we can move on to the main benefit, which is that we receive the Decadent Lifestyle Living Standard. Now, to test the Decadent Lifestyle Living Standards, I have created a single-player game, taken an empire with the Pleasure Seekers Civic, and I've matured the galaxy, as well as just set up some planets to a point where they are relatively specialized, and there should be a mixture of both workers, specialists, and rulers. Now, the main point of this test is to look at 3 different living standards. We're going to be taking a look at Utopian Abundance, Academic Privilege, and lastly, of course, Pleasure Seekers. We're going to be looking at just the overall consumer goods upkeep for the pops, as well as we're going to be looking at just some planets, looking at their stability between each one, and we will be especially looking at the ruler class strata and checking out their happiness and the overall pop approval rating on these planets spread between the 3. Now to start, let's check out Decadent Lifestyle. As we can see here, all of our pops have plus 20% happiness unless there is a consumer goods deficit. And we have different pop upkeep, 1.5 for rulers, 0.75 for specialists, and 0.5 for workers, as well as the same ruler and specialist political power of decent conditions, being 700% for rulers and 100% for workers. Now, if we check out our overall pop consumer goods upkeep, it is at 188.30. And then if we look at a random planet, like Pemcrew here, we can see we have 50 pops with a stability of 67%. And if we go over to population, we can see here we have an average pop approval of 66%, with rulers being 64, specialists being 67, and workers being 67. Now we can see here we have a lot of specialists, some rulers, and some workers. So the overall percentages here equate to +9 stability from pop approval rating. Now keep in mind, as you increase the amount of rulers on a planet, either through science director jobs, maybe aristocratic elite, or more specifically, if you are going the commercial route and are spamming merchants, the viability of pleasure seekers kind of drops, as the upkeep or the consumer goods upkeep for your ruler class is quite extreme. But the consumer goods upkeep for your specialists and workers is actually relatively reasonable. But now we can look at Utopian Abundance. Now, looking at Utopian Abundance, we can see we have the same exact benefit where our pops will have plus 20% happiness, unless there's a consumer goods deficit. And our unemployed pops will have normal happiness and also produce 2 unity and 2 research points each. But the downside is that our upkeep for rulers, specialists, and workers are all 1. So, as we can see here, with our array of pops, we have 260 consumer goods upkeep. And if we look back at Sir Pemku, we can see here our stability is at 68%, so 1% higher than Pleasure Seekers. And if we go over to our pop approval rating, we can see here that rulers have a little bit less than we did in Pleasure Seekers, as they have the plus 700% bonus. And our specialists have the vast majority of the political power, as there are 39 specialists on this planet. And our workers have slightly higher political power. The thing to keep in mind is that the happiness levels between the Pleasure Seekers and Utopian Abundance is going to be exactly the same. There's no difference there, it really just depends on the political power. So, with Pleasure Seekers focusing more towards rulers and specialists, whereas Utopian Abundance will split it more evenly. So looking at our last living standard, we have Academic Privilege. This will give rulers and specialists plus 15% happiness, and our pops will produce plus 10% research points, unless there is a consumer goods deficit, as well as our unemployed pops will have reduced happiness. Our pop upkeep will be plus 1 for rulers, plus 1 for specialists, and plus 0.25 for workers. While our ruler political power will be increased by 900%, and our specialist political power increased by 400%. As we can see here, our consumer goods upkeep is 188.60 for total pops, which is just barely more than the Pleasure Seekers, but basically identical. If we are to look at this tech world again, we can see here that our stability is at 64%, a slight decrease from pleasure seekers, and our pop approval rating is at 61%, another slight decrease from pleasure seekers. And as you can see, the rulers, specialists, and workers overall have lower happiness. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that our workers will cost very little in terms of consumer goods, as well as our specialists, the researchers, and our science directors will produce 10% more science. So there are some trade-offs with academic privilege in terms of slightly reduced stability and approval, but slightly increased research. Now, looking at a more just kind of general setup here, I apologize for the relatively janky graphs. But to explain it briefly, pleasure seekers, academic privilege, and utopian abundance are all here and represented on the ruler, specialist, and worker strata for the consumer goods upkeep, and then how many pops there are, the total cost for each one, and the total cost overall. So for example, with a even spread of 33 rulers in your empire, 33 specialists, and 33 workers, pleasure seekers would have 90.75, academic privilege would have 74.25, and utopian abundance would have 99. Now, looking at a more ruler-heavy spread here, we can see that pleasure seekers does become a bit more expensive, even compared to something like utopian abundance. In an empire with 50 rulers, 25 specialists, and 25 workers, maybe something close or similar to a merchant spam, you're going to have a very high upkeep on your consumer goods because your rulers have that extra 0.5 consumer goods upkeep, compared to academic privilege only clocking in at 81.25, and utopian abundance, of course, 100. Something with more of a specialist heavy focus, we can see that pleasure seekers and academic privilege are a lot closer. So we're going to see pleasure seekers only at 87.5, academic privilege at 81, and utopian abundance still at 100. Utopian abundance is going to be the most expensive unless you are running significantly more rulers. And the last theoretical thing to look at would be, what about a worker-heavy economy? Pleasure seekers, not doing too bad. You still have to pay 0.5, which is a bit, compared to something like academic privilege, where now your consumer goods upkeep drops quite significantly down to 62.5. Utopian abundance still at a standard 100. And we can see that pleasure seekers only at 81.25. Now, the last thing to go over, it's kind of a minor bonus, is that similar to utopian abundance, pleasure seekers and corporate hedonism, they will both give you 0.5 trade value on your workers, in addition to your specialists and rulers, as opposed to academic privilege, which will only give you 0.5 trade value on your rulers and specialists. So we have to keep that in mind and factor that in. For most organic empires, if you're not playing at Megacorp, it's going to equate to a slight increase in your economy, some extra early energy. It's never a bad thing, it's just not as impactful as you'd expect. And for a Megacorp running corporate hedonism, the issue arises that if you take a corporate hedonism, you will tend to have a lot of rulers. As running mercantile, you can get merchant jobs very easily through the mercantile tradition. So running corporate hedonism is nowhere near as powerful or useful for those empires, just because the sheer amount of consumer goods you have to upkeep your economy with just isn't worth it. So now that we've taken a deep dive into pleasure seekers, I'm just going to give kind of a quick review, my personal opinions on it, and then just an overall rating. And then after that, I'll dive really briefly into corporate hedonism, and then that should conclude the video. But overall, I think pleasure seekers as a civic is actually not as bad as people think. The increase in consumer goods, in my opinion, can be worth the happiness benefit. And as well, you can usually offset the early game consumer goods increase by the fact that you're getting slightly more energy income as well with the 0.5 trade value per worker. So, for every 2 workers, you're getting an extra energy credit effectively, which isn't too bad actually, and it kind of adds on to that. And the extra stability on your planets will just help you eke out a little bit more in the early game, so you should be able to offset it. And as long as you're not going like a merchant heavy build or ruler heavy build, you should be fine. And I would never really recommend pairing merchant guilds with this anymore, just because the sheer upkeep cost just isn't worth the opportunity cost, at least in my opinion. The minor benefits to pleasure seekers being the pop growth from entertainers and the extra amenities from servants, those are extremely minor, case-by-case scenarios. If you're playing around it, then sure, you can take advantage of it. But for most empires, it's just probably not going to come into play. But if it does, you know, it's never bad to have those bonuses on hand. But truly, the only benefit to pleasure seekers for most people will be the living standard. And I think it's possible to make it work for plenty of empires, and does have some benefits. You can take this as well and shift into it late game. Maybe you could pick it up as your third civic once you have a strong enough consumer goods economy and can kind of weather the storm. Then you can switch into this, get some extra resources from jobs, from your stability, and it will make more of a difference in the mid to late game as well. Now, moving on to corporate hedonism, I think this is just nowhere near as powerful as it could be due to how a lot of megacorps try to play. You know, merchant jobs are really good for your megacorps, so getting a merchant job and stacking merchants is sort of what you try to do most of the time, and it's just always good to have them, as they give you extra stability if you're running extra ruler political power. As well, they just produce you a lot of trade value, and having the extra 0.5 consumer goods upkeep on this, it just might be better to run Utopian Abundance or something else. So I think moving on to the actual rating, I would give pleasure seekers somewhere in like the rating of a C, maybe to a C to C plus. And I think for corporate hedonism, I would probably give this a D to maybe D minus, because I think for most of the time it will just be too expensive. But that has been the Civic Deep Dive into pleasure seekers. Thank you for watching and listening, and if you've made it this far, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and press the bell notification if you want to know when I post. There might be slightly fewer releases for my videos because of Christmas and everything coming up. Just won't have as much time, so I apologize for that, but I will still try to get as many videos out as I can and continue try to increasing my video quality and editing quality as well as audio quality. But thank you and have a blessed day.